Welcome to SLP Nerdcast, your favorite professional resource for evidence-based practice in speech-language pathology. I'm Kate Granbois.
And I'm Amy Wonka. We are both speech-language pathologists working in the field and co-founders of SLP Nerdcast.
Each episode of this podcast is a course offered for ASHA CEUs. Our podcast audio courses are here to help you level up your knowledge and earn those professional development hours that you need. This course, plus the corresponding short post-test, is equal to 1 certificate of attendance. To earn CEUs today and take the post-test after this session, follow the link provided in the show notes or head to slpnerdcast.com.
Before we get started, one quick disclaimer. Our courses are not meant to replace clinical advice. We do not endorse products, procedures, or other services mentioned by our guests unless otherwise specified.
We hope you enjoy the course.
Are you an SLP or related professional? The SLP Nerdcast Unlimited subscription gives members access to over 100 courses offered for ASHA CEUs and certificates of attendance. With SLP Nerdcast membership, you can earn unlimited CEUs all year at any time. SLP Nerdcast courses are unique, evidence-based, with a focus on information that is useful. When you join SLP Nerdcast as a member, you'll have access to the best online platform for continuing education in speech and language pathology. Join as a member today and save 10% using code NERDCASTER10. A link for membership is in the show notes.
This episode is brought to you in part by listeners like you and by our corporate sponsor, Practice Perfect EMR. Billing, scheduling, documentation, patient communication, business metrics, and more. Practice Perfect EMR specializes in speech therapy practices like yours, connecting everything. Check them out at www.practiceperfectemr.com.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. We are so excited to welcome 2 guests who have been here before. We've had a great time catching up with the 2 of them for, I'd say, almost 40 minutes since our recording time started. And we're really excited to share all of their brilliance, wisdom, and laughter, likely, with the rest of our audience. Welcome, Natalie Douglas and Kathy Binger.
Thank you. We are very excited to be here again.
For sure.
Well, we're super excited to have you. And you are here to continue our discussion on bridging the research to practice gap in the field of speech-language pathology. The laughter has already started, folks. If you are not accessing this through YouTube, I'll just let you know, Kate is silently cracking up there.
I'm going to be fine. We're going to be fine. It's going to be great.
We're going to be fine. So before we get started, Natalie and Kathy, can you please tell us a little bit about yourselves for our audience members who may not have listened to your prior episodes?
Go ahead, Natalie.
Okay, great. So right now I am a professor at Central Michigan University in a speech language pathology department. My background, I was a clinician for about 10 years in hospitals, skilled nursing, home health settings before transitioning back into academia. And I've actually been here at Central Michigan for 10 years, which I don't know how time flies, but it does. But primarily, my research aims to improve quality of life and communication for people with dementia living in nursing homes. And what goes along with that, and why I'm here with Kathy today, is how we can merge the research to practice gap with implementation science. So people living with dementia, their communication needs in nursing homes, that's just, one small area of people that we serve. But, I've been really lucky to get to work with lots of people kind of across our scope, because the principles and the tools of implementation science can really help to merge that gap kind of in whatever setting that you're in. So that's a little bit about me.
And I'm Kathy Binger. I'm a professor at the University of New Mexico. I'm an SLP as well, and I practiced as an SLP for about 8 years before I got my PhD. So worked in lots of different settings, particularly with young children, Head Starts, preschool, that kind of thing. And I've had my PhD for a long time now. So I've been here at the University of New Mexico for about 18 years, something like that. And I was interested in implementation science before I knew that implementation science existed. I think like Natalie, I've always been interested in doing work that was going to have a real life clinical impact, and was frustrated for a lot of years seeing that a lot of the quote unquote research evidence-based work that had been completed was not necessarily being used commonly in clinics and in clinical settings and educational settings, and certainly coming to realize a lot of that had to do with how that research was created to begin with, and that it wasn't necessarily devised to be constructed to be culturally sensitive for one thing, but also clinically feasible to do these things. So that's my interest in implementation science, and it's such a pleasure to be here with Natalie. We work with two very different populations, but our motivations for implementation science come from exactly the same place.
I really love the idea of two scientists, two researchers from such vastly different areas of interest really working together with a shared common goal and understanding. So I'm very excited to get into the content for today. I know we're really going to be unpacking the research to practice gap, which is something that we did in a previous episode that Amy already mentioned. So today's episode is a part 2 to that original episode that aired, I think, in 2021. And we're recording this in October of 2023. So this is a long time coming. If you have not listened to the part 1, please feel free to go back in time, give it a listen. Today, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what action steps we can take to mend the research to practice gap and how we can make it better. Before we get into the content, I do need to read our learning objectives and disclosures. I will try to get through that as quickly as I can. Learning objective number 1, describe levels of involvement for researchers and non-researcher invested parties depending on the project. Learning objective number 2, list the 5 key dimensions of research to practice partnerships. And learning objective number 3, list at least 2 real-world examples of research to practice partnerships in action. Disclosures: Natalie Douglas's financial disclosures. Natalie receives a salary from Central Michigan University and the Informed SLP. She also receives book royalties from Plural Publishing and has research funding from the American Speech Language Hearing Foundation. Natalie is a member of ASHA SIG 2 and SIG 15, the Gerontological Society for America, and the Aphasia Access Group. Kathy Binger's financial disclosures. Kathy is employed by the University of New Mexico. Her non-financial disclosures: Kathy is a member of ASHA and Special Interest Group 12. Kate, that's me. I am the owner and founder of Granbois Therapy and Consulting LLC and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures: I am a member of ASHA SIG 12 and serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy.
Amy, that's me. My financial disclosures are that I'm an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. And my non-financial disclosures are that I'm a member of ASHA Special Interest Group 12, which is AAC, and I participate in the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. All right, disclosures are done. On to the good stuff. Kathy and Natalie, why don't you start us off by giving us and our listeners just a little recap about implementation science? I think you both talked a bit in your introductions about sort of what's drawn you to implementation science. So maybe you can talk a little bit about why it's important for the field of speech language pathology, like super Cliff Notes version, because we do have the other podcast for listeners.
Go for it, Natalie.
Okay, yeah, so I think a sum up would be implementation science is technically the study of how we get interventions or assessments or really any practice of interest, something that might work really well in a lab or controlled setting. And implementation science is the study of how we get that into the real world. So in our field, that's going to look like schools, hospitals, rehabs, places where we're serving the people that we serve. So one thing that's happening, so the field of implementation science has been around for almost 20 years now. So they had their inaugural journal kind of started in 2006, and we've been a little behind in kind of catching that train in our field. But even for the people that have been at this for a long time, they're asking questions like, perhaps there's still something fundamentally wrong with something being created in a research setting and then pushed into a real world setting. So perhaps when we think about this kind of the next iteration or what the future of implementation science might hold, and what I think is super valuable for our field, is to stop and critically reflect on how evidence is even constructed to begin with. Because if we're not able to get that evidence from, where in the context of where it's actually happening, then maybe it's not remotely relevant to where we're trying to push it in. Maybe it's not even meeting a community need. So that's kind of my Cliff Notes version. And Kathy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, what you said reminded me of our funny discussion about the ivory tower when we talked about this the last time. And I believe the never ending story came up for some reason.
Oh my gosh, it did. Atreyu.
It just came across my Netflix page the other day, so it made me laugh and think about that. So I think that's why that was top of mind. So anyway, the old, quote unquote, old approach to doing research is, for people to be in their ivory towers thinking up these great ideas, all these PhDs who are supposed to know stuff, and coming up with assessments, coming up with interventions, coming up with approaches to try to help people in our world with communication disorders, and then living a life of frustration and blaming clinicians for not doing the things that we, meaning academics, have been spending our lives in all of our wisdom trying to impart to the clinical world out there. And the reality being that really the flip side is what we need to be looking at, which is, as Natalie said, the work that academics are doing is through an implementation science lens, inherently needs to be tied to real life clinical practice and educational practice and medical practice, and that we should not actually be doing our work without involving these very key invested parties to informing us and working with us and working hand in hand with us to devise programs and assessments and whatever it is that we're working on from the get-go to make sure that they are responsive. So it's really a fundamental mind shift that's required, as well as a fundamental research practice shift that's required. I think there's a lot of needing to let go of ego and let go of, and it works in every direction. You guys have done sessions and even written a paper with Natalie and others on power privilege and how people are looked at up and down, different levels of the ivory tower, if you will. That those things need to be considered and reconstructed with different frameworks so that we are really all working together in functional ways from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it's super exciting as a clinician, that this sort of shift from researcher as keeper and disseminator of information to forming these collaborative partnerships. I know we were all at the Implementation Science Conference through MGH, and awesome conference, by the way. If you're listening and you're interested in implementation science, it's a wonderful opportunity to learn some more. And one piece that's interesting is just thinking about within those different types of partnerships that might happen. And this gets a little bit into our first learning objective, but there really can be flexibility. It sounds like there really can be some flexibility in terms of the different roles of the different participants, the researchers, the non-researchers who are involved in implementation science. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit just about what those different levels of participation might look like.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. And this I've taken from, it's the International Association for Public Participation in Research, but I think that we can learn a lot when we think about how clinicians, or ideally even clients themselves and families and patients, might participate in the research process. But what you have is essentially a continuum where the least level of involvement is that of informing, right? So it's kind of very similar to what's happening now, right? You go to a conference and a researcher is like informing the clinicians about, this is the results of the research, right? So I'm letting you know, and I'm going to keep you informed, right? Like how you're sort of doing that with this podcast in a way, right? So we were talking off mic earlier that Kathy has some new studies coming out and like, getting something scheduled to like let your audience know about some developments in her work, right? That's kind of informing, right? And then the next level is consulting, right? So this is where you are really getting some type of feedback. I think about maybe some focus groups here, right? Like this is kind of what we're doing, and what do you think about this? What are some of what your ideas are? What are your concerns about this? And we're going to incorporate that feedback either into the intervention development itself or into some type of the structure of implementing the intervention. And then you have involvement. So this is where you really are working closer together. So I think you're having more than just a pre and post kind of focus group meeting, but you're really working throughout the construction of that research to ensure that people are understood and that their concerns are being fully addressed throughout the process. And then you have collaborating. So this is really when, if you're thinking about it from a clinician standpoint, the clinician and the researcher would really partner in each aspect of the decision making. And you're really, as a researcher, would be looking to that clinician for advice and innovation on how to kind of form solutions, and the researcher is incorporating those advice and recommendations. And then really the most involvement you could possibly have, according to this continuum, is the word empower. So really at this point, the researcher implements what the clinicians decide, right? So I would envision something like the clinician saying, this is the area of need. This is where we need data. And they're really calling the shots. And of course, the researcher is there with, perhaps the study design and the methods and the how to go about it. But in terms of like, really, what is the research question? That's coming from the clinician standpoint. And really, in terms of from the inform piece all the way to the empower piece, I think it's important to realize that none of those levels of involvement are wrong in and of themselves. And I don't think Kathy nor I are coming on here to say every project a researcher does has to be empowering, right? But I think it's important as researchers that we consider, how do we want to involve clinicians and at what level, and to let clinicians decide based on their different capacity levels and what they're able, not because we know they can do the job intellectually. So it's not a matter of that. It's a matter of productivity, and can they get it done during their workday, or do they have to, like what many clinicians do this research participation as like a hobby outside of their normal work hours, because there's no compensation for that during the day. So those, I think it's important to think about where clinicians might want to be involved, where researchers might want to be involving clinicians and, again, patients and families ideally, and be explicit about what the roles are and how you might want to proceed.
I so appreciate that you brought up the infrastructure related barriers here, because I think there are a lot of clinicians who would love to participate in some research practice partnership, but exactly like you said, there's no funding for it. They don't have time built into their day. They don't have the support from their administration. They don't have time that they can take out of their personal lives. And there are only some action steps that we can take to mitigate those infrastructure related barriers. One thing that you said, one of you said earlier that I want to just bring up again is this concept of ego and power differential. I think another barrier, at least from a clinician's perspective, is feeling like we don't belong, feeling like we shouldn't have a place at this table, feeling like, well, I'm a clinician, not a researcher. I can't do research. Or the researcher doesn't need me there or doesn't want me there. Or, there is this invisible cultural construct that we don't belong. We don't have a place in the ivory tower. We don't have a place at this table. And I think that is something that we can actively work to change in ourselves and through conversations with other people. And it's a very complicated mess. These are not things that we're going to solve overnight, but I wanted to highlight those two particular barriers that you brought up, because I think they're both really important.
Yeah, I totally agree, Kate. They are really challenging and they are really important. It's still, Natalie and I talk about this sometimes, we go to conferences and people come up to us and, talk to us like we're all that. And we're like, no, we're not. We're just getting paid to do a different job from your job. We're getting paid to do a complementary job to your job. And we can't actually do our jobs without you. This is I like to think of it the same way I like to think about how I like to work with families, which is we're all in this together. We all have our areas of expertise. When I work with a family, one of the first things I always say to them is, I may have some expertise in speech and language or in augmentative communication or whatever it is, but you're the expert on your child. And I absolutely, we need that expertise just as much as we need my expertise. So I'm really looking forward to working together with you. And I think of implementation science and this partnership work as being very much coming from that same frame of reference of we all really, not just in a roses and sunshine and butterflies kind of world. Oh, we all need to work together. We really all need to work together if we're going to change outcomes, improve outcomes for individuals who have communication disorders or swallowing disorders or whatever, or impairments or differences or whatever we're talking about. We genuinely all do need to work together.
So now Natalie and Kathy, you've both mentioned family components, and I wanted to circle back to that for just a second, because we've talked a lot, and we talked a lot in our last podcast about the power differential and the dynamic between people who are in the researcher role and then speech pathologists who are in the clinician role. And I was curious if you felt like, now that you've done more with implementation science and learned more about it, have you felt any difference in it shifting your dynamic with your clients and their families? And if so, can you talk a little bit about how that might be different when you're using an implementation science approach versus like a previous, more traditional research?
Natalie, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, I think I can. I think that what your question is making me think of, Amy, and it kind of goes along with what Kate and Kathy have said, is we have to think about knowledge and what we consider to be knowledge that is of value. Because in the scientific community, the knowledge that is most valuable is data from a randomized controlled trial, traditionally. And that's so good for so many reasons, right? Like, I am so glad that I can take ibuprofen when I get a headache, and that all of that data is supporting that, right? Like, we need that. But when you start to get into behavioral treatments, which is most of what we do, right? We're trying to change behavior of somebody. Things get real complicated real quick. And I think we have to wrestle with, as a scientific community and perhaps as a clinical community too, how do we value the lived experience, right, of our clients and our families and what they are telling us about what is happening to them, right? Like what their symptoms are, what they're experiencing. And I think what implementation science does, and definitely implementation practice, or like really getting these things into the flow, is kind of equalizing those different forms of knowledge, right? And to be able to take a wider view to say, yes, it's not just, the whole, what almost every research methods class is based on, the hierarchy of research, where a meta-analysis is at the top and then a systematic review and then expert opinion is like the lowest, right? And I just sort of wonder, when we think about families, clients in particular, what are we doing with that, right? And so that's what implementation science has helped me to do, is to really reflect on my own perceptions as to what does knowledge mean, right? Whose knowledge do I value and why? And starting to try to really say that this person who is in front of me, if it's a nursing assistant or a speech pathologist or a person living with dementia, this is their knowledge, and it's equal to, right, some data that I might get from somewhere else, because we're in this murky world of human behavior change. And to try to make it any more linear, it just doesn't work.
Thank you. That was helpful. Because it does seem like it's such a different way of thinking about research, at least as somebody who's just been on the consuming end of research for a long time. So it does seem like it would have such profound effects, like shifting to implementation science on all sorts of parts of that. I know that I'm trying to keep an eye on the time too, but we should look at our next learning objective. We should not get on too many tangents. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit just about some key dimensions of research to practice partnerships. Natalie, I know this is another article.
Yes. And maybe, Kathy, you want to chime in here with some examples from some of your projects. And we talked about this a little at the implementation science conference that Amy mentioned. But this is a model that was kind of really brought to light to our field by Crystal Alonso and colleagues. It's in the American Journal of Speech Language Pathology, where it talks about if you're going to have like a successful research practice partnership, right? So thinking back to that continuum that we talked about earlier. So this is more in like the collaboration phase. What makes that successful? And so there are 5 dimensions that she talks about. And if you're interested in this, I really encourage you to check the article out. She's got a really cool infographic in there. But the first kind of dimension is building trust. And that's huge, especially when we have all of these barriers and power differentials and all of these aspects that we're up against. The second is conducting research, not just to publish it, but to inform action. So it's really talking about something that's iterative and really probably never ending, right? Because like you do a study and then you learn from it and then you do it again. And then the third piece is supporting the partner organization in achieving its goals. So I work with some health systems, I work with some nursing homes. One of the goals of the health system that I'm working with is to reduce falls, right? And you might not think that that has anything to do with speech language pathology. We think it does, right? But that's their goal. So it's like letting them drive the bus in terms of what the practice organization, what their goals are. And then the fourth one is producing knowledge that's going to inform improvement efforts more broadly. And then the last and final dimension is to think about capacity building of whoever is participating to allow them to engage in partnership work. So we talked a lot already about some of the infrastructural barriers to doing this work. So thinking about having those like frank discussions about bandwidth and priorities and what you're able to do and when, all of those factors really contribute to a successful research practice.
And I know we talked a little bit, Natalie, at the implementation science conference, just about how some of those infrastructure things, just thinking back to the different levels of involvement that you might see in a project. And to your point, that empower level might not be the best fit for everything. So I might be somebody who has infrastructure barriers in my environment, but I really would love to be involved in some of this research. And so some of that flexibility and having those ongoing conversations about what is a realistic ask, like what's a barrier versus what's a roadblock, I think were the terms we were using, and I think that that's probably a helpful conversation to have on the clinician side as well as the researcher side. I don't know if either of you want to talk about some projects where you've maybe experienced barriers or roadblocks and like worked through that with your teams.
Yeah, I'll talk about that, but maybe not even just the roadblocks and barriers, but some of the other pieces as well. So, going back to that step one of building trust and cultivating partnership, I'm working with a group here, and we presented at the Implementation Science Conference, the MGH conference, together with Jessica Matney and Kitty Estrand at the New Mexico School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and they both work at the school, and they work with primarily preschoolers who have multiple impairments, including visual impairment. And I've known one of them for a long time, the other one not so long, but we've spent a lot of time together, like having really, we've been having weekly meetings for quite some time now to work on building that trust and cultivating that partnership together. And they're very ambitious. They have, what's helpful in working with them as part of their school mission is to disseminate good information and for them to be creating information. So that fortunately that's part of what they do. But even then, even though they have some time that's supposed to be dedicated to that, it's very difficult. And so they've tried to do some research projects on their own. And they spent a lot of time and have some expertise in that, but had some challenges with it. And so, I kind of, as I've been shifting some of my focus and really wanting to take this relationship in a direction where we were bringing implementation science to bear, they were very excited about that. And we've been working together on that for a while now. So one of the things that we've been working on is taking the data that they collected themselves, and they really needed my expertise to kind of help them get it ready for publication, because there is a value of getting something out in the world that way, and they can go to conferences and do presentations and that sort of thing. And so I've been able to help them out with offering some student assistance with analyzing their data and helping them develop things like fidelity checklists to see if they really were implementing, what were they doing when they were doing their intervention, and us working through that, like me looking at it from a researcher perspective and them looking at it more from a clinical perspective, and us finding a place in the middle to be able to define what they're doing. And just earlier this week, it was so sweet. We've been working on doing a treatment fidelity checklist. One of my students has been looking at the sessions, which kind of freaked them out a little bit, like, okay, like somebody else is going to be looking at this to see what we've been doing. And my student looked at them and came and shared the results, and they had good fidelity with what they were doing. They were so excited that the operational definitions that we had worked on together, and that the things that they thought they were doing, they were actually doing in the intervention. And it was just really just fun and exciting to see their level of excitement and their level of investment in all of this. And I think because we've spent this time building this trust and building this relationship, it's really contributed hugely to helping us move along. And for me, we're really looking at, not just for me, for all of us, we're looking at hoping to work together long-term on larger projects. And so we're looking at this smaller project right now that everything didn't go right for them. We're going back and doing some subsequent analyses to try to really figure out, okay, like this didn't actually change with this person. Let's go back and see what did change. Let's look at these things. And for them, as they've shared with me, just meeting with me weekly and having my eyeballs on the data too, and having a little help from my students has made a huge difference for them. And they feel like they've gotten further in this relatively short period of time than they were getting for a couple years. While I was back here very much in the background, not really directly helping them. So it's really shifted things for us, and it's been such a positive experience. So I think the big barrier so far was more when I wasn't involved, and we started overcoming barriers the more I got involved. One of the other really practical things is something I think Natalie brought up a little bit earlier, that is a bit of a barrier that we're going to have to figure out as we move forward, has to do with funding. So some schools will not allow us as researchers to buy out the time of a teacher. So like I may be able to get grant funding to support our work, but the school, like in this case, the school's saying, like, that was one of the first things that they were like, hey, we all have to meet, like, and we need to meet soon if you're going to be applying for grant applications, because you can't, basically, you're not allowed to buy out their time. This has to be done as part of their regular work. Or, and we were like, okay, well, what if it's on Saturday, and can we pay for their time if we have some Saturday activities that we do, or trying to figure those things out. Those can be some of the roadblocks that they're not necessarily, I don't even remember which one's worse, but some things that we can at least climb over. We can figure these things out, but like, I haven't done this work in this way before, so I really need to think about this. They need to think about it. We need to find a way to work through this so that we can not allow that kind of thing to really prevent us from doing good work, but that's still going to be a way that's going to honor the time and not just be an over, create this hyper burden on my colleagues, my clinical colleagues, but find a way to make sure that they're okay as they're doing this work, and that their level of involvement is appropriate, and that it's not too much for them.
I think that's a great example of an infrastructure related barrier. I mean, and I'm thinking about this story, this example that you've shared, and thinking about any clinician who's listening, who's, excited about research, doesn't want to get their PhD, but is listening to this and going, yes, I want to be maybe not empowered, but I want to be consulted. I want to be asked. I want to play. Let me in, right? And where do we go? How do we go about making or initiating those relationships? I'm asking this question. I'm not even sure that there is an answer. I'm asking this question to the universe. This is one of the problems that we haven't necessarily solved as a field. And Kathy and Natalie and Amy too, having participated in the Implementation Science Conference, if there are resources out there, I would love to hear about them. I'm sure our audience would love to hear about them. Just, I think that there is this feeling of being in a dead end. And so back to what I said earlier about ego and power differential, not feeling like we belong at the table. But even if we do feel like we belong at the table, what door do we walk through to get to the room where the table is? How do we go about doing this?
Yeah, I think that's such a legitimate question. And it also points to there are really very few, if any, situations where researchers and clinicians are like mixing it up in a informal way, right? I mean, it just doesn't happen. I can tell you that the large majority of my clinician collaborations is somehow connected to conferences, be it at the state level or at ASHA, where people have come up to me again, as Kathy said, inappropriately, or, being like, oh, wow, no. And I'm like,
are you trying to tell us that people fangirl over you, Natalie? Is that what you're saying?
No, not really.
Yes, they do.
Yes, they do. It's okay. It's it's okay. It's
Natalie's so comfortable with that. She privately just can't wait for all the
crawling out of her skin
on her. She just,
for anyone who doesn't know Natalie, she's the most humble, approachable, like a brilliant human on the earth. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I had to make a funny. I apologize. Let's move on.
So uncomfortable. She's closing. She's like covering.
She's gonna leave. She's gonna hang up on us. Don't go.
Oh my God.
Anyway, as you were. So people approach you at conferences.
Yeah, and they're like, I really love your work. Like, let me tell you how we might do this in this nursing home. And literally I will be like, well, do you want to try this in your nursing home? I'm not kidding, and then, and it doesn't happen to everyone, it doesn't happen to like every person that we talk to, but it's, so I would say to clinicians, like, the talks that you go to that you really like, the articles that you read that you really like, the blogs or whatever you're getting your CEUs and you're like, I really resonate with this, to reach out to that person would be 100% appropriate and welcomed by the large majority of clinical researchers. And again, of course, humans are humans, so you can't guarantee how people are going to respond. But at least in our field with implementation, people who are doing this type of clinical research, they're doing it to have an impact. And so when clinicians who are working with a certain population want to collaborate or have ideas, it's just so welcome. And I think that, once you start to really get in the groove and develop that trust and partnerships, you realize, oh my gosh, we're both people, and Kate, when we first started working together, you called the Google folder Fancy Pants.
It's still called the Fancy Pants. Who has the fanciest pants? It's the Fancy Pants party. Because you have fancier pants than me.
Told you from our very first interaction with you guys. That was my first email to you guys. It was like, you can't call me fancy.
I know. But do you see how these concepts are so culturally ingrained that even as I've had the privilege of having some academic work in the last 2 years, and I am constantly butting up against my own internal critic because I am not worthy, I air quotes. And I think that these concepts of, I don't belong at the table, I don't belong here, nobody wants me here, are very quick at work, I think, without us realizing it. I think, Natalie, it was you who brought up or even pointed out to us that originally on this podcast, we had a disclaimer that played at the beginning. And you can, if you go back in time and listen to the earlier episodes, it's still there because I don't have the bandwidth to go back and edit all those files. I'm not doing that. But it's still there. And it says we are not PhDs, but we do research our material because we felt we had to disclaim that we were not that fancy.
Our pants are not that fancy.
Our pants are not that fancy.
If you want, I can stand up and show you how not fancy my pants are. I'm not sure that you want that. So,
but I think it's worth just repeating for anyone who is listening, who is at a conference and is, sitting in the chair and really resonating with the lecture and feeling intimidated to go speak to that person, or it's just it's sort of like in those magazines where it's like celebrities are people too. Well, researchers are people too. Yeah. It's not a thing.
It's not a thing. And I think it used to be a thing.
Yes,
right?
That's fair.
I mean, it comes from a real place. When I think back, I'm the oldest one of the group here, so I can think back longer. So I was talking about the 1970s to somebody the other day, and they were like, well, you weren't alive then. I was like, yes, I was. I remember. But anyway, academia, that you think back, right? It's the older white guy with the white beard and the spectacles and the tweed jacket with the leather patches on his elbows kind of thing. Like
that was incredibly accurate and detailed.
I've got my tweed jacket hanging up behind me, but I don't think you can see it. So, but right, like this image is still out there, even though, especially in our discipline, it's changed. It hasn't changed enough from a racial ethnic perspective in terms of cultural diversity, but it's changed dramatically in terms of male-female ratio, right? Like when I was starting, there were at least 50% of my professors were always male, and that's just not the case anymore. Our department is, it has more, we're like 5-to-2 ratio of female to male in my department for tenure track PhD faculty members. So that has shifted dramatically, I think, in most CSD departments over time, but we still have this cultural residue. I just made that term up, but we still
I like that a lot.
That we still live with that. And yeah, so we have to, I think it's going to keep shifting as time goes on. But we still have a long way to go. Another piece of it to encourage folks to reach out to us is that in the post-COVID, as much as we are post-COVID world, we've, as academics, just like clinicians and everybody else, we really learned how to do things at a distance. So, more and more projects are coming along where researchers who are doing implementation science work, as well as other kind of clinical research, can do their work with people from all over the country. So whereas, for example, the communication partner instruction work that I used to do, we would always do it in person. If and when we get back to doing more of that work, we'll never do it the same way again. I'm sure that we'll do it using telepractice. And that opens us up, that makes our lives easier as researchers, because our participant pool is wide open. And it also opens up the opportunities for clinicians who are in rural areas, who aren't near universities, all of those things. So that maybe that's a little bit of a push to encourage clinicians who are interested in working with researchers to go ahead and reach out to not just one person, but to many people, because who are doing some, work that you're interested in, because you can, like, as a researcher, you can only take somebody on to a research project if you have a research project with clients that meet those particular criteria. Like, that's just a reality of it. But having some persistence and some grit with contacting people, I think is a good clinical practice, if that's something that you're interested in doing.
I know we have one more example that we need to get to for our third learning objective of examples of research practice partnerships. But before we get into that, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit more about the role of cultural competency in this whole arena. You mentioned it a few minutes ago, and I know it touches everything we do. And we've already spoken about power differentials and, different hierarchies and all of these cultural components that impact this problem. I wanted to just give it a moment, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about how cultural competency touches all of these components and variables.
Natalie, you want to take that one, or you want me to take a stab?
Well, I actually happen to have a paper that I was just reading for a talk I'm preparing for that addresses this exact thing, but the article is by Anna Bauman and colleagues, and it's called Advancing Healthcare Equity Through Dissemination and Implementation Science. And essentially, what they have in this article, they have a figure of guiding principles if you want to achieve healthcare equity in dissemination and implementation science. And there's 4 of those. And the first is racism must be recognized as a fundamental driver of healthcare inequities. I think you could probably say the same thing about educational ones. Equitable healthcare requires active engagement of community members and other relevant partners. Equitable healthcare requires multi-sector partnerships, and context is central to healthcare equity. So I think you could substitute schools or educational environments for healthcare in all of those places. But they have those principles, and then they have like 8 recommendations. Again, the onus of this is on the researcher, in my opinion, to consider, anchoring their work in this. But they actually have in their table 1 in the article, they have 60 opportunities for action for researchers in terms of how you might structure.
60?
60. Yeah.
60.
It's
all right.
8 recommendations with 60 opportunities for action for researchers.
Wow.
Well, that's some homework for us.
It's everything. I think it's everything. I don't think you can really talk about this work without it. I don't know what you think, Kathy.
Oh, yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, we're just constantly learning about this, and I was thinking about the class that one of my classes I was just teaching earlier today, and we were talking about cultural responsivity, and it was actually in the context of doing early intervention work, and the wonderful, some of you may be familiar with FGRBI, that Molly Romano is directing that now. The what's it stand for? Family guided FG family guided. Oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed, Molly. I'm sorry if you're listening to this that I don't have it right. Routines-based intervention. That's what it is. Family guided routines-based intervention. And we were, I was talking with my students about how what a great program it is, and how at its very core, it's the foundation of the program. Part of the foundation is being culturally responsive, and that you walk into every situation with every family from a very open stance. So, and I think this goes back to ethnographic interviewing too, which you guys have talked about on this podcast before, where you're going in and asking very open-ended questions, not making assumptions. So tell me what mealtime looks like within your family, and not even making an assumption. I think I was just listening to a podcast episode where you guys were just talking about this. Maybe they don't even eat breakfast, or maybe there's a meal in there that isn't. So just asking really open-ended kinds of questions so that they can tell you their own experience without me putting my judgment on them, right? It's important to be discerning. It's important to not be judgmental, right? We can be discerning without being judgmental. And I think implementation science, it's one of the things that really draws me to implementation science as well, is that, are we perfect at it? Absolutely not. But if we're going to do this work with our partners, going back to that second learning objective of building trust and cultivating partnership relationships, as step one of that, we have to do this and we need to do this, and we want to do this from this very open stance of wanting to understand what's going on with our partners, whether those partners are educators or medical professionals or families, whoever those partners are. We need to be open and understanding what the reality is of their environment. So in the FGRBI case, we're talking about families. If I'm working in a school, I'm talking about, what's going on with the SLPs and the educational assistants and the special ed teachers and the whoever it is I'm going to need to be working with. What are their caseloads like, and who's on their caseload, and what's going on with these family members, and blah, 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 like all the things that have an impact. And I need to be realistic about that in implementation science work, not try to go in and change the system so that they can do my intervention, but for me to look at the current state of the system and create interventions and assessments that can work within these existing systems. So the mindset is a very different one entering into all of that. So hopefully that got it, some of what you're asking.
That's huge, Kathy. I mean, it's just so fundamentally different, right? It's just so fundamentally different to go in, but at the same time, it's like, why in the world have we been waiting so long to do this? It just doesn't even make sense. It's like we're trying to go into, and this is a lot of things. One of the things that we, I don't know if this fits with the learning objective, but in one of my partnerships with nursing homes, they weren't able to do the study and they felt terrible. But I was like, no, like we need to know. And so the structure where my intervention was being implemented would not allow it to be implemented. And it was no fault of any individual person, but the nursing homes are having a huge crisis right now, more than before COVID with staffing. And so what I'm trying to do with that is kind of walk that line of like, yes, I need to get data for my grant, accountability, but also I need to let these higher ups know what it's like in a nursing home. I need to let them know that there's no way that they can think about offering somebody a whiteboard to communicate key words when they've got 8 people who haven't been toileted. This is the reality of it.
Natalie, that to me goes directly back to what you talked about earlier with, from a researcher perspective, what is good data, right? Good data is, I have 8 people who need to be toileted and they can't be messing around with a whiteboard right now. That is important data too. And so one of the things I love about, this is a little more researchy, but one of the things I love about implementation science is this ability to, there's a value that's placed on different kinds of data. So not just the really clean cut, kind of numbers driven data, but using other kinds of methodologies like qualitative methodologies where we can talk about the real life lived experiences and interviews and focus groups and whatever it is to gather information about these kinds of things. And so the things that we used to try to clean out of our data set of, oh, that's noise, we now embrace the noise with implementation science, and we embrace the mess. And I've always liked the mess. So that's really I think that's such an important fundamental piece of implementation science world and work.
In our last couple of minutes, I wonder if you all could give us one last example. I know we've already gone over two, but are there any other examples out there that might, just give us another perspective of how a clinician might get involved in a research practice partnership? So you've talked about clinicians working in a nursing home. You've talked about clinicians working in a school setting. What else is out there just to give clinicians who might be interested in this work a little bit of a glimpse into what this work is like?
Yeah, I kind of wonder about state conferences. I kind of wonder about the implementation science conference. I know a huge focus of that is partnerships. And so there are a lot of ways to connect. I know it's hard to get the off. Amy, you were a speaker and you could only get off for the talk, which was just very realistic.
Very clinician versus researcher landscape right there. That's a good.
Exactly. So, I mean, networking that way, I know social media is like a blessing and a curse, but there are a few researchers that are on social media and we'll have discussions and you can reach out, you can slide into their DMs, if you will. There are lots of ways to do that, but I think, conferences, networking, social media, I'm trying to think what I'm missing.
I mean, just for another plug about the implementation science conference, as somebody who attended as a clinician, it was a super cool experience. It's a virtual conference, which is also for me always a barrier remover because I don't have to travel. I don't have to get time off from work to travel to go there. And I do feel like at the end, there was an actual form that people could fill out to show that you your contact information. I'm interested in, this is where I currently work. I'm interested in research in this area. So that's definitely something to keep your eyes open for. I don't know if there's a list to get on, an email list to find out about that. Email. Also, if I've learned anything through this project, it is that you can email professors and they are generally very friendly people and will respond to you with kindness and generosity. So old-fashioned email.
Yeah, and one way that I think a lot of people don't know about to find researchers, right? Like whatever your thing is, whatever your area of interest is, you can go on ResearchGate, is one place to go. It's just like it sounds, researchgate.com. I think it's .com. And you can look up your topic of interest, whether it's childhood apraxia of speech or AAC or what have you, and put in some keywords and find, you can find research articles if that's something that you actually want to do on there that people have that are up and publicly available. And once you find papers that you think are of interest, even just by reading the abstracts of, this person's work is really interesting to me, you can follow that person. And then you get notifications when they publish something new, and you also can, it's .net, it's researchgate.net. Thank you, Amy. Thanks for checking that. And so you can follow those people to learn, about what they're doing, but you could also figure out who you want to follow and who's of interest to you, and then contact them directly. And I think essentially every academic has an email address online that you can find on their university homepage or on their university page. So,
as we wrap up, are there any parting final words of wisdom that you would like to leave us and our audience with?
I mean, I don't know if this is what I would like to say to clinicians. Not only do you belong at the table, but in my mind, I think Kathy would agree, you are like the MVP at the table. period. Like, you are the implementer. Like, it doesn't happen without you, both not just from you implementing a research intervention that was developed without your input, but also in your, I mean, maybe that would work if it meets a need that you have, but also in your ideas, right? Because people in academia are very out of touch with what is happening on the ground in day-to-day clinical practice. And without your input, these cycles will continue. And I in no way want to imply that I think the burden is on you as a clinician to do that. But if you have the desire and the capacity and you want to, you are so more than welcome and truly like the MVP for sure.
Mic drop.
That was really funny.
I had to say that.
We keep talking about the Implementation Science Conference from the MGH, or the Massachusetts
General Hospital.
Thank you. Yes, Institute of Health Professions. And I don't know if we have show notes or anything that we can put this in, but it looks like even if you weren't there from this year's conference, you can purchase all of the talks. They call them the lightning talks, and this is where people give, it looks like it's $30, and you can get immediate access to all conference talks recorded on April 27th and 28th, 2023, and it looks like they're gonna, the conference talks are eligible for CEUs, and you get a certificate of completion, and I wonder too if that might help you get connected with that group. So yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for being here and sharing all of this with us. Anything that you all mentioned throughout the course of this episode will be listed in the show notes, along with links, any links that are available. And if you've made it this far in the podcast, presumably you've also listened to part 1. And learned a lot about implementation science and the action steps that we can take as clinicians to bring ourselves to the table, participate in these research practice partnerships. So thank you both so much for being here. This was incredibly helpful, and we'll have to have you back again soon.
Thanks so much, Kate and Amy. We really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh. Yes, you guys are fab. Thanks so much.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you again to our corporate sponsor, Practice Perfect EMR. Billing, scheduling, documentation, patient communication, business metrics, and more. Practice Perfect EMR specializes in speech therapy practices like yours, connecting everything. Check them out at www.practiceperfectemr.com.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon.